Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/child-welfare.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the SafeCamp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of SafeCamp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or SafeCamp Audio on all social media. On this week's episode, we continue our summer of SafeCamp Spotlights with Kee Tobar, who is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, and also is the host of their podcast, How Is That Legal? One of my favorite names for any podcast. Show where Kee and guests break down examples of systemic racism in the law and in policy. Before we get to my interview with Kee, let's hit a few headlines real quick. Starting in Indiana, where the child welfare system has been the subject of two notable class action lawsuits in recent years, both of them dismissed by the U.S. 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, and litigators in the newly filed Annabelle B. et al. V. Eric Holcomb, that is the name of the governor, are hopeful that the third time will be a charm, as the saying goes. Here's a little backstory. So in 2019, there were two different class action lawsuits filed against the state. One was called Nicole K. v. Stigdon. Stigdon refers to Terry Stigdon, who at the time was the child welfare director. She's not anymore. That case sought to compel a right to counsel, a guaranteed right to counsel for children involved in child welfare cases. There are many states where that right is guaranteed, but there's, I think, 13 or maybe 12 remaining where that right to counsel is not guaranteed. And Indiana is among those states. They often use court-appointed special advocates or guardians ad litem to represent kids in court. So the 7th Circuit dismissed that case in 2020, ruling that because children are not automatically entitled to lawyers, it would be inappropriate for a federal court to resolve the appointment of counsel question in Indiana. Same year, 2019, a nonprofit litigator named A Better Childhood and Kirkland Ellis, which is a law firm, took Indiana to court over conditions and process problems, let's call it, in foster care. And they had 10 plaintiffs in that case. The suit accused Indiana of, relying too much on institutional care, placing youth with kin without really doing much to vet those relatives or support them, and then in some cases really unsafely reunifying children with parents. The agency sought for the federal district court in that case to dismiss it. They didn't, but then the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals did, partly because a lot of the kids had what lawyers called mooted out. They had essentially left foster care, so they did not have standing to ask for much in the way of relief because they were already out of the foster care system, but also because in the court's opinion, the relief that litigators were seeking on behalf of those kids, even if they weren't mooted out, was not a list of things that the federal court could be or should be in the business of prescribing. So it's really set aside the right to counsel one. Nothing else has come up about that. This one that was just filed, Annabelle v. Holcomb, is kind of take two for that other lawsuit because the same litigators have come back. They have a new set of 10 plaintiffs that are in foster care now, and they have a much more specific list of asks that they believe only could be affirmed and mandated by a federal court. So I'll drop the link to the story that we wrote about this. All right, next headline. I came across this interesting white paper recently released, I think it was in late July, out of New York, that I think speaks to bigger issues around reunification from foster care. So the Institute for Community Living put this together. It's the paper is called Barriers to Reunification. City lacks system to help reunifying families across appropriate housing. So mouthful, but the actual paper is pretty quick and an easy read. So the Institute, which operates a women's shelter, explains in this paper how silos kind of within the city's safety net make it not impossible, but very functionally difficult for a parent who is involved with child welfare to jump from single adult housing that might be supporting them to something that could accommodate a family. The report really gets into the specific policies and recommendations that the Institute has around this, but they start off with an example from one of their clients, Amanda, who lost custody of her 3 kids and then was put on a reunification plan. And while she was working on that plan and doing so effectively, she came to the Institute's women's shelter and during that time regained custody of her 7-year-old. But you can't have the child at that shelter. And in order to leave that shelter in a way that would allow her to have her child with her, that she had already gained legal custody of, she was only being offered single adult housing directly. To get back into the pipeline for a family setting, she would have had to started out living with her kid in a family homeless shelter, which she understandably did not want to do. So she got custody of her kid back. She had all kinds of options to go live in single adult housing, which she had to pass up because she didn't want to take a housing option that didn't let her take her kid that she had gotten custody back of. So basically the answer for her was, well, if you want to start back in the family housing, you have to start at a homeless shelter. She said, that's not where I want my kid to be. So as I mentioned, I think, this speaks to a bigger conundrum with reunification, and that's that it's the ostensible priority outcome for cases where foster care is used, but systems are often not built or more often not resourced to really put a ton of investment into making that work beyond just services. Here's a clip of Washington State child welfare expert Dee Wilson, who writes a kind of underground child welfare newsletter called The Sounding Board. But he joined us on the podcast last year and I think really kind of talked about this in a very interesting way about what's wrong or what people don't get right, I guess, about reunification services. So I'm going to drop a clip in here of Dee from that conversation last year. Have a listen.
Family treatment drug courts, they actually do work. There's a whole body of research on that subject. More recently, safe baby courts of the sort that originated in Dade County, Florida, and that have spread all over the country. So we know that in reunification, for example, if it's going to be done more effectively, it's got to be done in the context of a team. I mean, that can be done within a court structure through family treatment drug courts, through safe baby courts. But even if you didn't do it through court structure, you would still have to have a team around the family. So that would be the first thing. It turns out that poverty-related services matter a huge amount in reunification, and we have known that for more than 15 years. There have been ample studies on this subject. So, for example, the best book on reunification, the best chapter ever written on that subject, in my opinion, is the Jill Barrick book, Take Me Home, which came out in 2006 or 7. And she describes 6 women in California who get their kids back after years of effort there and after many, many failures. The main needs of those women were concrete needs. I mean, they were needs for apartments, they were needs for housing, furniture, food, all those kind of things. So it really does matter whether the low-income needs of families are met in reunification efforts. That matters a lot. So one of the ways, for example, that federal policy ought to change here is that once women, mostly women, get kids back in a reunification effort, they ought to get the same amount of financial support as adoptive parents get after adoption, the same amount. So there ought to be an equality there.
I'll include a link to the report for those interested. It's, again, pretty short read, that this white paper from the Institute, and they actually have a mousetrap for this that they've worked on a kind of small scale with the State Office of Mental Health in New York. It's called the Emerson Model, and it kind of is meant to, provide a path to cut across those silos and help a single mom who is in pursuit of reunification, actually make that happen. Sticking with New York for just a minute, the imprint's Shushanti Sarkar reported last week on the turnover being experienced at child welfare providers in the state of New York, which experienced a 42% turnover in 2022 for child welfare caseworkers. That is double the rate of 2020. Sarkar talked to one veteran social worker at length, along with other experts and officials, about some of the drivers behind this. I will, as always, link in the show notes for people that want to read more. No spoiler for many, I'm sure. The non-competitive salaries in jobs that can be very high pressure is not a great look when you're in a very competitive, tight labor market. I think probably a lot of our listeners might have already heard about this, but it appears that one of the most famous adoption stories of all time was, in fact, not an adoption at all. Michael Oher, retired NFL star, subject of the book and hit film The Blind Side, has filed a lawsuit that alleges, among other things, that he was misled into believing that he was a part of the family of Leanne and Sean Tuohy. Instead, he alleges, the two became his conservators in the early 2000s and then drew in profits from the film The Blind Side without really sharing any of those proceeds with him. I'm going to link to our reporter, Michael Fitzgerald's really great story on this, which, in addition to just getting the facts of this lawsuit down, also kind of draw in reaction about how some adopted people are reacting or feeling about this. My only 2 cents past that, this dispute seems somewhat to come down to how the difference between conservatorship and adoption was communicated to Oher when he was 18, because as far back as a memoir he wrote in 2011, which is called I Beat the Odds, he relayed that the Tuohys, quote, explained to me that it means pretty much the exact same thing as adoptive parents, but that the laws were just written in a way that took my age into account, end quote. But conservatorships are not like adoptions. Conservatorships are meant to give certain people power to make decisions on behalf of another person with a physical or psychological disability, where they may be challenged to safely do that themselves as a result of those issues. Michael Oher was an adult when this went down. He was 18, and he's never been diagnosed in this way. So it's very unclear why a conservatorship would have been necessary. Adoptions are done to make you part of a family that legally you are not a member of yet. It's much more than that on an emotional level, of course, but on a basic legal level, it is that. You were part of another family, you are now part of the adopted family. It is a fundamental legal change in that status. The Tuohy's lawyers have said it was about setting things up for Michael to go to college. Their lawyer, Randall Fishman, told the Associated Press, I'm quoting here, there was one thing to accomplish, and that was to make him part of the family so that the NCAA would be satisfied because Sean would have been a booster of the university. I'm not going to go into all the backstory of this, but Sean Tuohy went to the university that Michael Oher ended up playing college football for, which is a whole other kind of side tangent of this thing. Now, one prominent expert on conservatorships, Victoria Hanneman from Creighton University, has questioned how all of this went down. She was also quoted in that same AP story and says, I'm frankly floored that any judge allowed them to use the conservatorship in this way, with the purpose of circumventing NCAA rules. Yeah, it sounds bad when you read it like that. She said that there were other legal options available, such as just getting power of attorney that wouldn't have stripped Oher of his legal capacity. Quoting Hanneman further, at the end of the day, you do not put an adult in a conservatorship because they need help with a driver's license or a college application. And really, regardless of that part of the dispute entirely, the Tuohys accepted an Angels in Adoption Award back in 2009 from the Congressional Coalition on Adoption Institute. They've openly referred to their relationship with Michael as adoptive. If you go look at the interview they did in depth with George Stephanopoulos, that was one instance where they talk about it. Also, adult adoptions are legal in Tennessee, as they are with, I think, 29 other states in addition to Tennessee. So it's kind of also unclear to me why, even if conservatorship was somehow practical in a short-term sense to accomplish what Michael needed for college, why they wouldn't have been able to file for adoption eventually, or been more transparent about the fact that they had not done it. All right, last thing for this week, got a few kind of big job changes within the child welfare world to note. Linda Spears spent the last 8 years leading Massachusetts Child Welfare Agency, which is well past the average lifespan for somebody in that type of role. To that point, she is the longest tenured child welfare director in state history at 8 years. Now she is returning to the organization she spent more than 2 decades at beforehand, and that is the Child Welfare League of America, where she will succeed Christine James Brown as its director. Christine James Brown stepped into that role in 2007. I have talked with her about this. I remember interviewing her on her way. I don't know if it was on her way for the first time to the office, but really right as she was taking that job at Union Station in DC, asking her what her plan was, because at the time in 2007, it was not at all clear that the Child Welfare League of America was going to survive. It was not in a good fiscal position. So gotta tip your cap from a programmatic level to Christine James Brown that this organization is even here, existing, and ready to pass the torch on to kind of one of its longest tenured leaders, Linda Spears. Aubrey Edwards Luce is well known in the field of child welfare policy. She was a senior attorney for the Children's Law Center for 5 years before heading up the child welfare and youth justice portfolio at First Focus, which is a very large national advocacy group. Now, Edwards Luce has been tapped to lead the Center for Families, Children, and the Courts at the University of Baltimore. And then final job change to note, Allison Blake, who once led New Jersey's child welfare system before spending some time with the Annie Casey Foundation and then leading a major social service provider in Connecticut. She is going to join the Biden administration as the director of the Unaccompanied Children's Program within the Office of Refugee Resettlement. We've talked about the Unaccompanied Children's Program several times on the podcast. Just for people who don't know it, this is really the only federal foster care program. So basically, when a minor from a non-contiguous country, so not Mexico or Canada, so from any other country, arrives at the border in search of asylum, we handle that a lot differently than we handle adults or families that show up intact. The child is taken into custody by Border Patrol. They are then quickly handed off to the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services, and it is the job of this Unaccompanied Children's Program to first find shelter for the child. Ideally, these are kind of either foster homes or small residential campuses where their educational needs, their just sustenance and nutrition and some legal help and all those things are kind of attended to, all while trying to find a vetted sponsor for the child who they can live with in the United States while the asylum claim kind of works through court. Often that'll be a parent that's in the country or a relative that's in the country. So this is a program that has, over the course of 10 years, really exploded. The numbers have gone down a little bit this year, but I think around 2013, the budget for the Unaccompanied Children's Program was something on the order of $380 million, and now it is multiple billions of dollars because we have seen just many, many more youth from non-contiguous countries arriving in search of that protection. So that will now be Allison Blake's job. All right, when we come back, our interview with Kee Tobar, host of How Is That Legal?
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10 today.
All right, time for another SafeCamp Spotlight interview. All summer, we are bringing in hosts from SafeCamp's inaugural group of member podcasts. You can check out all these podcasts at safecampaudio.org, and we are regularly promoting and featuring their work on social media. You can follow us on any of the big ones at SafeCamp Audio. Today we have Kee Tobar, Director of Race, Equity, and Inclusion at the Community Legal Services in Philadelphia, and also host of How Is That Legal? Kee, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with you. Let's get these guys to know something a little bit about you. You got to give me one favorite in these categories I'm going to give you. You can give me more than one. You got to give me at least one. TV show or movie, sports team, musical group, or book. Kee Tobar, what do you got?
Sports team is wherever LeBron goes. Is my favorite sports team. Book. Right now, I'll say my favorite book is Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Maree Brown. TV show. I'll say Abbott Elementary. I'll stick with Philly and say Abbott Elementary.
Okay, good stuff. So wherever LeBron goes, where do you think he's going next year? Still a Laker?
I don't think so. LeBron, before anything else, is a business person. And so part of me believes that he does end it with the Lakers because, of course, I do think next year is his last year. I think it's his farewell year.
But yeah, I don't know about this being his last year. I think that you don't think he wants to play with his son one time?
I think he wants to play with his son, but I don't know if his body will hold up.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one thing. And I also am not sure that his son wants to play with him. So
Fair point. Fair point. Well, you gave us a lot of good favorites there. Thank you. Let's talk about how is that legal? Describe your podcast in 3 sentences or less. You're a lawyer. You can be brief when you need to. I know it.
We are not known for being brief. It's a racial equity podcast specifically catered towards those who are practicing in civil legal aid, breaking down systemic racism within the system, one case or policy at a time.
That was excellent. When did you start the podcast and how did it come about? I'm most interested of all the hosts in your answer to this. How did this come about as part of what you guys do, right, at Community Legal Services?
Right. So I believe that we started this podcast in 2021. And I know the thought for sure came in around 2020, 2021. We were doing in the thick of the pandemic. One of the ways that it came about is that I'm the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer at Community Legal Services. And one of the things that we'd already been having those conversations about implementing racial equity into our substantive work, into our way that we analyze the work that we do. One of the things, we're a 185-person organization. I am but one person. I have an assistant, but it's me, an assistant, and then the team of management that I work together with. But with that being said, it's part of the work is level setting, making sure that we're all on the same page, that we have similar information regarding how race intersects with our work. And it would be hard for me to kind of do trainings for all of 185 people and to ensure that level setting. So this was an opportunity for us to kind of in one, full sweep, do that level setting, do that communication, but also to highlight we've been doing work that have racial impact for a very long time, right? Because of the way that this country goes, there is a connection oftentimes between race and wealth and poverty. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to explore that, right? It's one thing to talk about racial equity as a theoretical framework. It's another thing to talk about how it shows up in our work, right? And so This was an opportunity to do that, but also an opportunity to have an accessible conversation, right? So we who are lawyers or who are legal advocates, we see discrimination and bias all the time within our substantive work, but most of it is lost on the general public in legalese. It's talked about in a way that is not accessible to the average person. And so this is an opportunity to be in conversation and in relationship with community and to explain what we're seeing on the day-to-day basis, but without legalese, in a way that if we're talking to our cousin or our friend or someone, so that they could also be involved and be informed in the conversation. So those are the two main reasons as to why we wanted to start it. And I guess I'll say the last thing is that generally when we think about discrimination, specifically racial discrimination or bias, this country as it relates to systems, we think about the criminal justice system. That is what immediately comes to people's minds. But the criminal justice system, while there is bias and discrimination and rampant bias and discrimination there in instances, the civil legal system has just as many extremes, right? When we go talk about housing court, when we talk about the child welfare system, right? It has things that are, I think, really, it's not taking away your your liberty per se, but it is affecting your family dynamic, affecting the autonomy of your family, affecting one of the essential needs, which is housing, right? And so it has great impact on people. And I wanted to make sure that we are exploring from the civil side how race and the intersection of other identities.
And I think it's it's an interesting needle to thread, because I'm like, if I'm hearing you right, like on one level, this is a podcast for 135 people. That's like, can we get a baseline training for the people that work here? But then also for this broader audience, which includes Luddites like me who are not lawyers. And I really do think that you do that really well. I've definitely appreciated, when you'll just stop a guest to be like, whoa, like, why don't you say what Medicaid is? Because I, as a podcast host, don't do that enough, where somebody will just rattle off an acronym and we're in the flow. And I'm like, damn, I should have gone back and said, like, can you say what that means? Because most people don't know. You can't assume most people know all this stuff. Let's talk about your influences. What is your favorite podcast overall? And give me another podcast kind of in your lane on social and legal issues that you really respect.
Ooh, that's a good question. My favorite podcast. I got to make sure that I say something that is not shameful to me. I listen to a lot of different podcasts. I think I really enjoy the 1619 podcast. As a history buff, I just think that I find that to be a fascinating podcast. What was the next question?
Well, I asked for one overall and one that was kind of in your lane about social and legal issues, which I think that might, if you want to count that as both, I guess it does.
Right. So yeah, also the 1619 podcast. But I'll just throw one out there. I'm also a person who's interested in FIRE. Have you heard of that?
What's it called?
FIRE, Financial Independence, Retire Early.
Oh, no.
So there's a community of people who are interested in those types of things. And so there's a podcast called Bigger Pockets that I also am listening to. I find it to be.
I mean, you had me at Retire Early. I'm on it. I'll look as soon as we're done here. Okay, so I won't make you alienate any particular guest you had by forcing you into the box of pick a single favorite episode, but here's how I'll ask it. Which episode stands out to you so far as like the particular embodiment of what you were trying to do with the show? You know what I mean?
That is a heavy question. I enjoyed every episode. I think every episode had something that was connected to the root of what we're trying to do. But if I am forced to choose one that I think really embodied what we're trying to do here, I'll actually say it was the last two episodes, because the last two episodes were really breaking down how race is embedded, and race and racial hierarchy is embedded in the legal system. And it has been from the beginning. It was intentionally into the legal system because race is a constructed thing. It was partly constructed by the legal system. And thus, if we have that understanding or that foundation, we see then it is logical to see how race has played out through the legal system once you understand the foundation of how it was embedded or constructed through the legal system. And so setting that just foundational understanding, because there were things that I wasn't necessarily taught, and things that you're not necessarily going to be taught specifically in law school, right? But it was really important, that particular conversation, because it's based in fact. There are cases that we can go back and read. So I think because that's one of the tenets that I really wanted from the podcast. The podcast is not to force any type of opinion on anyone. It's actually to start a conversation, to be in conversation with each other. And let's look at these facts, and then we can be in conversation and discuss wherever we land, but just to have like the facts, right? To present the facts of what we see in the legal system. And so I think the last session does that, but it also created going forward, right? So it's not just about looking backwards and seeing how we've gotten to this point, but it's also about looking forward by taking the information we see of how it was constructed and how we got to this point, and how can we reconstruct, reimagine, reanalyze where we are going forward and what needs to be done in the legal system to kind of remedy some of the ailments based on how we have traditionally constructed race and the law. So I think the last one was both theoretical but also practically helpful.
Yeah, for sure. I think the one I learned the most about, because I had no idea about any of the sort of material beforehand, was debt after death. I didn't know any of that stuff about the way. I won't spoil it, but you should check it out if you are interested in learning about what happens when Medicaid is used basically to help pay for end of life care for poor people in this
Yeah.
country, and what happens to their families after they die. Really something.
No, I think like one of the also major things of the podcast you hope is that the storytelling, right? Or again, these are things that we see in legal aid. If you work in legal aid, you see these things happening. But I think the majority population would be kind of shocked as to some of the things that we see in legal aid, including debt after death, but also including things as it relates to the child welfare system, like what rights or rights families don't have, so on and so forth. So even me, like the original question we asked folks, or the beginning question we asked folks is how is that legal? I constantly and consistently find myself asking, like, how is that legal? And I've been an attorney for almost 10 years.
I think it might be my favorite title of any podcast. Who came up? Do you get credit for coming up with that? It's when you think of like all the wonky stuff around branding and how do you, what's in it? I mean, it hits on all cylinders. It's short and it's just like, it's something everybody says at one point in their life, whether it's legal or right, but everybody says that in some permutation.
Yeah. I think it was a team effort that we all.
Okay. Gotcha. So you guys are 17 episodes into the show now, many years into your own legal career. What is the all-time, how is that legal thing for you? I mean, what you know what I mean? Like, what thing have you come across and just that stands out? It's just like, how is that legal?
All time.
All time.
Well, one of the things that was up there was debt after death. I just didn't understand how that could be a thing, and maybe we should like go read and go listen to the podcast. But that was something that stood out to me. But I'll say also the child abuse registry was something that I thought, like, how is this legal? Because in this country we believe in process and we believe in making sure that everyone, regardless of if you are perceived as a perpetrator or that everyone has their day in court or has their opportunity to advocate for themselves. And the fact that with the child abuse registry, the registry that you're on for life, and you did not actually have to be the assailant. You did not have to be the person who committed the crime. You can be the parent of the person who stepped out to go to the grocery store. And if anything happened to your child while you were out, you could be held liable for that. And it's something that's on your record for life and can impact you, your family forever, especially financially, and especially as it relates to your name and your dignity. And so when we had a person on who was saying that they could no longer even go on field trips with their grandchildren because they were put on this registry for something that they didn't do.
That's what sets it apart from, I mean, we definitely have a lot of instances of collateral consequence in this country when you're on registries after you're convicted. That's the difference to me with the registry is not every state, but some states operate it where the barrier to entry is so low. You're just like, how is this possible?
Right.
Just being accused of something.
When we start thinking about, I just want to like, I used to work in the employment unit, and when I first was kind of introduced into those, I was thinking like as if I was a parent, and if your child just falls, like a 2-year, think about a 2-year-old and all the falls that they, or injuries that they may have, and how any of them could be used to bed you into this system, or how you could have a difficult relationship with your neighbor, and your neighbor could call and say that you did something to your child, and now you're embedded in the system. And if you're not sophisticated or have a sophisticated network, you could actually be involved in the system and fall prey to the system simply because you're just not informed and you don't have the advocacy network around you to help guide you through a system that is very, even as a lawyer, you have to first, when you're first doing these cases, you have to situate yourself on like, what are the processes here? Okay, so it can be very confusing for the average person. So that's one. It's a very confusing system with really, really high stakes. And so that's one that I was just kind of like, how is this legal?
That one certainly has more stakes than this, but of the stuff discussed on how is that legal, I think the one that stands out to me as the most, the howest of legals, I don't know how to put that, is when Ashley Sawyer joined you to talk about, towards the end of her conversation, it's just that it's still legal anywhere to have corporal punishment in school, is just very specifically, how is that legal? Like, and I mean, how has that not successfully been challenged to the Supreme Court? You know, we had a lot of Supreme Court decisions around things like juvenile life without parole, and I know that's a big leap from getting hit in school, but you know, we had a lot of this like casework around whether what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment for kids, and you know, these are things in some instances that if a parent did them might be considered, you know, they might get a call, they might end up on that registry.
Right.
But somehow at school, it's okay.
Thank you for pointing that out. And I think it's really important for us to note that it's still, I think people just don't think of it. As a person who's coming from the Southern context, which I am, I'm from Arkansas originally, I knew that corporal punishment was still on the books, still being used, not just being on the books, still being used in some places. But just as you're kind of shocked, it still shocks me, even though like I'm aware that it's still being used, because we also have the data now that shows the negative consequences, that type of system. And so that is also one that's kind of like, how is this legal?
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, you're 100% right. Like a guy like me, I grew up in Connecticut. I lived in DC. I live in Michigan now. I at no point that I live in a corridor of this country where that would happen in the last 50 years, I guess. But it's still surprising because of what you said, and also just the legal sophistication of advocacy now. I just think it's so like, it's just crazy that it hasn't risen up through the courts yet to me.
But also these things, their schools are generally handled to a degree locally, right? And so they become things of cultures locally. And so hopefully part of it is just, like I said, not lending one way or another, but educating people also on like those collateral consequences and what the data is showing regarding that, right? So just at least to put this on certain people's minds as to like why we probably shouldn't be engaging in this behavior at school and how it's not in the best interest of the child.
All right, last question for you. Are you working on season 3? And if so, do you want to give us a little taste of some forthcoming topics? Just teasers, just what else do you want to tackle?
We are in the midst of thinking about developing how we're going to develop season 3. I can't believe we're already at season 3. I guess time flies when you're having fun, but I can't give anything as to what will be available in season 3 because we're in the thrust of like development. But I will say that, you know, hopefully thank you to all those who have listened to the first 2 seasons. And I hope that people kind of tune back in for season 3 because this is a labor of love and we really appreciate doing it. And we also appreciate all the different people learning that we were in so many different states, right? And learning that so many different folks were listening and passing along and that it's being taught at law schools and so on and so forth, like has been really special and revelatory for us. And so we hope that people do tune in for season 3, but I can't give you.
That's a pro right there. No teasers. It's not going to give any of us an idea. Steal. All right. Kee Tobar, Director of Race, Equity, Inclusion and Community Legal Services, host of How Is That Legal? You can get it on their Spotify or Apple, but you can also get it on SafeCamp Audio, where we will be regularly featuring their episodes. Kee Tobar, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you to Kee Tobar of the Community Legal Services of Philadelphia and host of their podcast, How Is That Legal, for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the SafeCamp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or SafeCamp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. But we'd really appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just go to imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.